Imagine watching around half of a movie and thinking that it's great, but there's a thin line between that and coming off as generic. Don't get me wrong, I enjoyed Malignant and the first hour or so is great, even if not totally original, but I liked how it went about both telling and showing its story. Alongside cool camera angles, colors, and grandiose sets, the first hour of Malignant had me thinking that I was watching a movie that would at the very least become a cult classic. Maybe it's because I've seen a lot of horror movies, or movies in general, but if I see enough of one, I'll more or less know where it's going to end up. Despite having loved half of the movie, after a certain point I started to worry that it'd end up taking a nosedive before it came to an end. I started to see glimpses of this during some fight sequences. From how the movie was initially set up, I wasn't expecting to see action scenes that'd be more appropriate in one of the Resident Evil movies. With how it came off, I thought that it'd be a better fit in a sci-fi or original movie. Since the sequence didn't last too long, I took that as simply a slight bump in what was otherwise a smooth ride, but my suspicions would eventually come true, and that made me think less of it. Even if there were parts of Malignant that bummed me out, from the start, I thought it was a great looking movie. I watched it on my 4K OLED TV and there were moments where it truly looked stunning, but that quickly went away, and at times it was as if I was watching something slightly better than 1080p. Though that didn't last for as long as I hoped it would, Malignant was still able to deliver the visual goods, and I thought to myself that it's the kind of movie that you can watch on mute. There were some scenes that really popped out, and it was mainly during some moments where overhead shots were being used, and I thought those were especially nice when it kept going from room to room. At this point in time, long and complex sequences are used so often nowadays that they're no longer as special as they used to be, but it's still nice to see how something interesting can be done with the visual aspects of a movie while not having to rely on overused techniques. In continuing to discuss the visual aspects of Malignant, I'd like to bring up its sets and locations. Simply put, some areas looked great. Certain parts of the house in which most of the movie took place in looked grandiose, and towards the end, the abandoned hospital looked awesome. Abandoned hospitals are way overused in horror movies, so it's nice when something good can be done with them that doesn't leave you thinking, been there, done that. A movie largely delivering the goods as a result of how it handled the visual side of things may be enough for some, but I definitely had some issues with how parts of its story were handled. As I previously mentioned, there were moments where I was left thinking that Malignant could easily cross the line and end up turning into a generic horror movie. It wasn't just because of how some of the action scenes played out, but also because its use of humor clashed with what it initially wanted to establish. Malignant starts off as a movie in which something sinister is afoot, but before long, it got characters cracking jokes as if they were in a completely different movie. Knowing how to balance humor and horror is something worth knowing how to do, especially since the contrast between both leads to greater emotional highs, but with how it was handled in Malignant, I thought it brought the overall quality down. Don't get me wrong, it's not as if I don't enjoy humor in horror movies, seeing as how I love Tucker and Dale vs. Evil, but there's a huge difference between that movie and this one. At times it seemed as if Malignant had a hard time figuring out what it wanted to stick to. As a result of wanting to do both, you end up with a lesser experience. Something else I didn't like about Malignant was how the second half of the movie was handled. Maybe it's because it initially gave me high expectations as a result of how it worked to set up the movie, but when I realized that the villain more or less ended up being Voldemort from Harry Potter 1, that bummed me out. It's because even if I had issues with Malignant, it's not a completely awful movie. That's true, but its ending didn't make things better. The ending was especially disappointed because it reminded me of the fact that it sucks when something's ending doesn't match up with the rest of it. It's true that you can enjoy parts of something without having to enjoy it as a whole, but I'll gladly take a mediocre movie with a good to great ending over a decent one with a lame ending. To sum up, Malignant's strengths lied in its atmosphere, camera angles, color, and overall visual impressiveness. When it strayed from that, it got closer and closer to simply being one of those mainstream horror movies that we've seen over and over again over the past decade. You know the ones I'm talking about. They're the movies with endless sequels because they offer enough entertainment to the point where you can zone out, have popcorn at the theater, and feel as if you've done something more than what could have been done at home on your couch. Malignant wasn't a terrible movie, but I'm still disappointed because it could have ended up being more than it was. At one point I thought to myself that this is the kind of movie that I'd like to buy, but with how it turned out, I've changed my mind. If I were to see it on TV, I'd probably watch it for a bit, but knowing what I know now, it's not the kind of movie that I'll rewatch over and over again, as I usually do with some of my preferred horror movies. If you enjoyed this content, please feel free to like, comment, subscribe, and share. Thank you very much for watching.